Hi, my name is Kristen and this is Kristen Craves Book. You can probably tell that I'm still not in my normal filming spot. I will be next week, the beginning of October. I'm still at my parents' place, been here for a few months, and that has really affected my reading and my filming schedule. So we'll be back in the swing of things in October. That's when I get really excited about all of the fall content anyways. So hopefully I'll be back to at least one video a week coming in October, but for now I just want to wrap up my summer reading because I have some highlights and I didn't read a ton, but what I did read I loved a lot of it, and then some I was just neutral on, and then one permanent DNF. There were definitely books that I picked up that I just wasn't in the mood for or didn't have time for and couldn't really invest in, and that had nothing to do with the books themselves. That was just the way this summer went, so I won't talk about those, but I do have one hard DNF that I want to talk about. But for now I'm just going to talk about these in the order that I read them, and then we'll get to the DNF at the very end. And I'm not going to talk about any of the books that I read in September, even though most of September is still technically summer. In my mind, June, July, and August are the summer months, so we'll just talk about those. Starting with June, I read The Z Word, and this is by a new author to me, Lindsay King Miller. This might even be a debut. It was a perfect way to start my summer reading because I love a good slasher. I don't read a ton of slashers during the other months of the year, but something about a summer slasher just works. And this one is also zombies, and mixed opinions on zombies. They're not always my favorite, but if you lean more into the campiness of it, I can like it. And I do think that this book did some interesting things. This is sapphic. We're really focused on some of the complicated relationships in here, and that's probably where it fell short for me. The characters were a bit too surface level, and I wasn't invested in their past, their histories with one another, why they were together, why they even are drawn to one another in the first place. It just didn't really make sense to me. But the world and all the zombie stuff, it was graphic, it was gory, it was a fun time. So if you go into it for that, I think you'll like it. I think it's one you could probably read or listen to in an afternoon and just have a fun time with. I don't think it's a good one to like drag on because it's kind of forgettable and you'll lose your momentum, I think. I think the pacing is probably not perfect, but if you just sit there in one or two sittings and marathon this one, it's fun. It's just fun. And I also think there's some good commentary in this one that was handled in a way that adds some of the dark humor to it. And it all centers around pride, and I actually like the tagline for this. It says, "The first pride was a riot, the last pride is a bloodbath." And I would say bloodbath is the perfect word for this one. So I would go into this one for the goriness, the downright gruesomeness of it, and some of the social commentary, not for the characters and their relationships. If you can get past that, I think it's a good time. I then listened to The Undermining of Twylan Frank by Megan Bannon. This is a sequel to, what is that one called? The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy, that's it. That was a bit of a forgettable book for me. I enjoyed it at the time, but obviously it hasn't stayed with me as much. And I didn't think I would really prioritize the sequel at all, but then it was an ALC for Leo Burr FM, and I figured, why not? I'll go for it, and I ended up loving it. I think it is so damn sweet, and it follows older characters, which I appreciate it. We seem to be getting more and more older characters in these romances, but not as much in fantasy romance, so I like that about it. And it's friends to lovers. They were both married in the past and they were neighbors. Her husband passed away and he's since divorced, and they've been friends for all these years. But as the book goes on, they start to realize that maybe their feelings are a little bit more than just friendship, and I loved it. It was so sweet. And there's also a fantasy plot going on. The baby dragon was just a bonus. I think the world that Megan Bannon has created in this is really interesting. We're getting a third book as well, and we got cameos from the characters in those books, and it's just great. I just loved the relationship. She has a complicated relationship with her children as well, which I thought was interesting and really added to the story. And there's also a bit of a love triangle that happens, but come on, you know how it's gonna end. The other guy didn't stand a chance. And there's a baby dragon that becomes attached to Frank. It's like bonds with him because it like imprints on him or something, and I love it. It's so cute. So it's a really interesting world, fun time. It's like a me book. It's just a me fantasy romance, and I can't recommend it highly enough. I actually think that you could probably read this one without reading the first book, but I still think the first one is worth checking out just to get your foundation of the world and understand some of the cameos and stuff. But the more that I think about it, the more I don't think you actually have to read the first one. Just because the sequel is so romance forward that you can just fall in love with that, and you get enough of the world, and it's a separate plot from book 1. And I think the 3rd one follows a different romance, so it's one of those, you know how that goes. I finally read Flamefall by Rosaria Munda, which is the sequel to Fireborn, and then I haven't read the 3rd one. I thought I would marathon them. I actually reread the 1st one, so that's a thing. Then I read Flamefall, and then I was like, okay, I'll read the 3rd one, and then it just never happened. So I will probably have to reread the first 2 again because I want to get the full experience of the series, because both books were 5 stars, and I love everything about this series. If you're tired of dragons, I still think that this is one that is worth reading because it does something unique, and it has a dragon school, and while there are romantic plots in it, it's not at the forefront of this one. I actually think that the plot is more focused on the world and the politics. It's really political heavy in a way that I really liked. And the second book introduces a new perspective, which was a bit jarring for me at first, but I actually thought that it added something to the storyline, and it was nice and refreshing to see a third perspective of everything that is happening, because there's a lot of conflict going on and different opinions and different motivations, and you're really able to understand where everybody is coming from. And it's actually hard to decide who you agree with, because this is a world, in the first book, it is kind of like a utopia kind of thing, but when you dig deeper, you realize it's not as perfect as it seems, and people are on different sides and have different histories and different secrets, and it's just really great. It's a wonderful series. It deserves all the hype that it gets. I just need to finish it. That is the story of my life. Then I reread A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking by T. Kingfisher. I don't think you need me to talk about this anymore. I have read over 10 books from T. Kingfisher at this point. Never given anything under a 4 star. She is my favorite author of all time. She's fantastic. This continues to be my favorite book. I wanted to read it again because I've read so much of her stuff since then. I just wanted to see if it held up, and it does. And it's not going to be everybody's favorite because it's not what she is typically known for. It's not one of her fantasy romances or one of her horror books or a fantasy retelling, which she excels at, she thrives at, and she's a master in it, and I love everything that she does. This is a middle grade fantasy, so it's not one that I would recommend as like your first T. Kingfisher, or I think it's going to be the standout favorite for everybody. And in fairness, don't kill me, I still haven't read Sword Art. I've put it on so many TBRs, I talk about it all the time, still haven't done it. So that could be my favorite. I feel like it probably will be, but this is just so sweet. I love the main character so much. I love that she is 13 years old. She's put in a position where she has to save the world, and she's pissed. She calls out the adults in her life for it. She thinks it's ridiculous that the whole entire weight of the world is on her shoulders, and she thinks that that is silly. And I like that this book is self-aware like that. She has really interesting magic. She just wants to bake. Her familiar is a sourdough starter named Bob, and she has an army of gingerbread men. What else do you need to know? Okay, it's so sweet. I love it. I love it. I love that little subgenre that T. Kingfisher does. I don't know that she's put one out in a while, but like that and Minor Mage, like it's a very specific middle grade thing that she does that hits for me, but it's T. Kingfisher. Probably my biggest disappointment of the summer, and you're going to see a lot of these witchy books because a lot of what I read this summer was for the Black Hat Book Coven, the witchy book club I'm a part of. I always made sure to read those, and even when I wasn't reading anything else, so you'll see a few of those. But The Honey Witch, I'm so excited for. It was on my TBR before it came out. The cover's so me. It's cozy fantasy with witches. It just has my name written all over it. Everybody was telling me it's such a Kristen book. Like, just looking at it before anybody had even read it, it just screamed me, right? So I went into it with high expectations. So that could be part of it, but I don't really think that was the case where it was like it just was impossible to meet my expectations. I think even if I went into this expecting nothing, I wouldn't have loved it. The beginning was really interesting though. I like the magic. I think everything surrounding the bees and the potions with honey was really unique, and I wish I understood it more. I wish we got more into how that all worked. I appreciated a lot about the world. I liked the setup of it. I liked her relationship with her grandmother. She is raised in a household where she is not allowed to do magic, and she is sent to live with her grandmother, and it's really sad in the beginning actually, and I was attached. I actually got like emotional, so I thought I was gonna love it. And then we're introduced to the love interest, and I didn't understand what she saw in her. I didn't understand the attraction between these two at all. We actually got some absolutely ridiculous scenes in the second half that I think were supposed to be serious, but I laughed at, so that's not good. And I am somebody, you know this about me, I can suspend my disbelief very, very easily, especially for a cozy fantasy. I just wanted the vibes and the warmth of it and the joy of it, but I couldn't get past it in this one. It was just too ridiculous for me, predictable. I saw the twist coming from a mile away. There's potential in this world, and there's potential that this author will write something that I love, because I love her ideas, and this is a debut, so I'm not going to write that off completely. I will wait to see reviews of her next book if she ever publishes one, because obviously we have similar tastes. She's writing cozy fantasy witches that are sapphic, and I want to love them, but this just did not hit the mark for me. I will leave the live show down below because we had mixed opinions on it, so that's always a great thing. I love a book club book where not everybody loves it or not everybody hates it. It's more fun that way, so check out the discussion. It was an interesting talk. I then read City of Nightmares by Rebecca Schaeffer, and I think this is another case where the concept and the potential was better than the execution, and I hate saying that. And the books that I've talked about so far, this is the most forgettable for me 2 months out. So I think that actually says something. That's why it's interesting to sometimes do these wrap-ups 3 months at a time. Even though my ideas aren't fresh, you get an understanding of what has stayed with me. And I think that is important. Sometimes reading something that you quickly forget is great, and sometimes it's not so great. And for a fantasy like this, that's kind of darker in themes, I want that to stay with me. This is not supposed to be light. I want it to have a lasting effect, and it just hasn't. And I thought I would read the sequel right away because it's just a duology, and I tried and I couldn't get into it, so I just think that's it for me. But I love the idea of this, that it's a world where your nightmares can come to life and overtake you and kill you, and our main character has a sister who became her nightmare and went on like a murderous rampage, and it's a whole thing, and I think that is brilliant. But the one thing that stands out to me, and I don't know why I'm harping on this point and why this has stayed with me, is that there was just a random Taylor Swift reference. So I guess it's to make you feel like you're in our world, just different. But it was jarring, took me out of the story. I don't love when fantasy books bring in real life elements like Taylor Swift and Harry Potter. Those seem to be the ones that are go-tos, and it just takes me out of the immersion of it all. And I never felt invested in the main character. Again, I felt she was kind of surface level, but I liked the plot. I did like the plot. That's why I wanted to see where it went in the second one, but I just couldn't get on board with reading more from this character, so just abandoned it. It's too bad, but I think this author has a few other books that people like and I'd be willing to check out because, again, love the ideas. Now onto the book that stands out for me, probably my favorite or among my favorites. There's a T. Kingfisher, another T. Kingfisher in this list, so that'll be near the top as well, but this is one that, again, it's been a couple months and I still think about it, so it's a win. And it is I Was a Teenage Slasher by Stephen Graham Jones, another slasher novel for the summer, which, you know, I love, especially if it's a teenage one. I don't know why, something about teenage slasher novels, it's like nostalgic. I know what you did last summer, those kind of vibes. There's just something so nostalgic about reading a slasher like that this summer, but this does something different. I like that Stephen Graham Jones takes horror and kind of twists it on its head. It does something different with the genre. It's nothing that you expect. There's always some great commentary. Again, I always say that about horror, that I like when it has something to say, and often horror does more than any other genre that I read, and I think Stephen Graham Jones is like on the top of that list, and I understand why he's not the author for everybody. I think if you read one Stephen Graham Jones, you'll have an understanding of his writing style and whether or not it works for you. He's very wordy, probably too much information, probably a bit of a slog at points. The pacing's probably not perfect, but it works for me. I just like his voice, and I think he's got a very particular ethereal voice, and it's either going to work for you or it's not, and I kind of like authors like that. There's authors who I don't connect with their ethereal voice. The one that comes to mind for me is Maggie Stiefvater, and I've tried several books by her and they just don't work for me, but I love that you read something by her and you can tell that it's her, and I feel like that's Stephen Graham Jones. So you either connect with it or you don't, and I connect with it. And I think what this does so well is that you're following the perspective of a killer, and I've read a few of those this year and I always seem to like them if you're following the perspective of a villain, but a lot of those tend to be fantasy. This one is obviously a horror novel, and it is written like it's an autobiography of the killer. So he's telling you his story, and you empathize with him and you sympathize him and you understand him so deeply, and it kind of messes with you, but you're rooting for him, and I think that's brilliant. Pulls it off perfectly. It's a must read in my mind if you already like Stephen Graham Jones, but I do think if you haven't read anything about him, this is a good one to try to start with. But I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. Sometimes you're just in the mood for a book by Kennedy Ryan, and that mood seems to strike me often. Actually, I'm in that mood right now. I finished a book by her a couple days ago. I'm reading the sequel to that now, but I'll tell you about that in a future video. But I figured in the summertime I should probably finally finish the Hoop series. I read the first two, really liked the first one. It is heavy. She always takes on heavy themes. Didn't love the second one quite as much, but the third book's my favorite. It is called Hookshot, but as is the case with most of these romances, especially when it's a series like this one, I think your favorite's really going to depend on two things: the tropes that are used and the hero, the love interest, because I don't love super possessive love interests, but Kennedy Ryan tends to write them well, so I can get my head around them. But Keenan is my favorite of her love interests within this series. I have favorites outside of this series, but within the Hoop series, Keenan is my favorite because he's not a cinnamon roll, but he has cinnamon roll tendencies more than the other two love interests did. And it's a he falls first kind of thing, but he's going through a difficult divorce and he has a child that he has to think about, and she's kind of sworn off men, but he doesn't love that, so he's going to pursue her. But they start off as a friendship. He is okay with it at first. He just says, okay, if we can't be together, I at least want to be in your life in some way, and let's be friends. But he also puts his daughter first, which I thought was great. And he's got a complicated history with his ex-wife, so that adds some drama to it. And it's one of those books where I feel like a lot of the conflict was external instead of internal. Say this all the time, that is my favorite thing in a romance. So Kennedy Ryan, she just works for me. She makes me love things I don't think I'm gonna love. Do I love sports romances? Not really, because I've read quite a few and I don't tend to connect with them. But when it's Kennedy Ryan, it works for me. The new series that I'm just starting, I feel like if anybody else wrote that series, I wouldn't love it as much as I do. She takes very difficult topics and makes them authentic, real, you relate to them. I think in this book is probably another reason why I loved it so much, is that the themes in it are probably the ones that I related to the most, and why our main character is kind of closed off. And I loved her, and I loved that it took her a realize to recognize certain things in her life, and we talk about therapy and the importance of that. It's just brilliant. She's just brilliant. I love Kennedy Ryan. She's one of my favorites. And then after you read something by Kennedy Ryan, you tend to need a bit more of a contemporary rom-com kind of thing. So I went for Not Another Love Story by Julie Soto, who wrote Forget Me Not, which I read when it first came out, and I think that was her debut, and it surprised me how much I liked that one. And I thought that I would like this one more because I know it's not for everybody, but I like romances or just fiction in general that revolves around music. Even if it's like classical music in this case, he plays the cello, she plays violin, and they're in the same orchestra, and they have this moment where she's playing at a wedding he's attending and he doesn't recognize her, so they have this enemies to lovers kind of thing, or like a rivals to lovers, because they're competing for the first chair and everything in this orchestra. And I don't know, he was kind of a jerk and I never warmed up to him. I think this like Kylo Ren thing, it's just not my dynamic. It's just not my thing. Unless you're Kennedy Ryan, I'm not gonna warm up to like a possessive jerky guy. It's just not my vibe. And yeah, so I think that was part of it. I really liked her. I actually loved that so much of it was about her discovering her passions and maybe what she thought she wanted in her life, and the goals that she was striving so hard for and became her sole focus could change and shift. I think that was really interesting, and I loved seeing how she fell in love with music. And if you are not a music fan at all, if you're not into classical music at all, do not read this one. It's so much about classical music. You can tell that the author really is either passionate about it or did a lot of research about it. I thought it was interesting, but I can see why people would not be into it because it's a lot. And I liked that so much more than the romantic elements because I wasn't rooting for him at all. I was not rooting for them to be together, but it is a romance after all. So not my absolute favorite, but definitely will keep an eye on her third book, given the fact that I really liked the first one. If it's another Kylo Ren fan fiction-y thing though, which I feel like it might be because the first one was as well, it might not be for me, but I'll wait for reviews, we'll see. I was in the mood for some weird fiction. So I read Mother Thing by Ainsley Hogarth, and talk about weird. That definitely delivered. If you have complicated relationships with either your mother or your mother-in-law, this will either be helpful or will be difficult, I'm not sure. So yeah, this is a horror. It is one of those fiction novels where you're following kind of an unhinged woman. You know the type. They tend to work for me, but I don't pick them up as often as I should. And the thing about these is they always end up being 3 stars for me, but memorable 3 stars, and I never regret reading them. So it's a 3-star, but one that I still think about. There's certain moments in it that still hit. So we're following a married couple, Abby and Ralph, and we're in Abby's head, and let me tell you, sometimes it was difficult to be in that place. Sometimes I had to take a break from her. Not a book I would read in one sitting. I had to read a couple chapters at a time she was messing with me a little bit and I had to take a break from her, which I think is effective. I think that's what the author was going for, so that actually really worked and was well done. And Ralph's mother dies and is haunting the two of them in their basement. And she always had a difficult relationship with her mother-in-law. There's more going on here than meets the eye, and Ralph is something else. But yeah, it's weird. It's weird, it's kind of gross. But it delivered what I felt like I expected from it, maybe even more than what I expected from it. I'm curious, I know that this author has another book out, but I haven't read it or really looked into it too much. So if you have read that, let me know. And let's just admit, but this has one of my favorite covers of all time. I don't know what it is about this cover, but it's kind of iconic to me, and I think it sets up what the story is about well. So we'll leave it at that. Okay, some books I actually have with me because I brought them with me and I really relied on my Kindle a lot this summer, but I do have a couple of physical books. One that I actually bought and read the day that I bought it is The Last Murder at the End of the World by Stuart Turton. Stuart Turton wrote The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, which I really liked. And when I talk about Stuart Turton, I always say I'm in awe of his mind, and that continues to be the case here. This is more sci-fi from him, and the way that he's able to weave a story is quite interesting. There's a lot of layers to everything he does, but it always feels accessible, and I always feel good recommending his books to people because you don't get lost in the weeds. I think that is something that I've noticed about him, even though there's a lot of layers to it, and you know, he really had to sit there and plot everything to make sure it all made sense. It doesn't feel that way when you're reading it, so I think that's good. I don't think this one in particular is doing anything that unique because it's in a world where there's a utopia and we're following the people who have survived, and they realize, or one of them starting to question, if everything is as good as it seems and if they have been told the truth. And I don't really want to even read the back because I think the back kind of spoils some things that don't happen till like a third or halfway through the novel. So I think that's all you really need to know. They're on a time crunch. There's a fog that surrounds the island that they're on that killed everybody else in the world, and it's closing in on them, and they have to unravel the truth. And there were some reveals that, looking back on, I probably should have seen coming because they make sense, and I think there was a lot of foreshadowing, but I was just bopping along, and I think that's because of the way he writes, and I didn't think about it too much, and when the twist came, it hit me and I was like, oh, you should have seen that coming, but that's good. And I just kind of love that about it, and I think that if I reread this, it would be fun to go through and see all the foreshadowing moments, having learned what actually happens and what the story is actually about. So it definitely has rereadability potential as well. And I haven't read his second book yet. I really should, because I just think he's kind of brilliant and accessible, and again, not groundbreaking, but really fantastic. Okay, here's a Tegan Fisher. Of course, I read her new book, duh, A Sorceress Comes to Call, and this is a dark Goose Girl retelling. I'm not as familiar with Goose Girl. I think I've read a couple of retellings, or at least one other. She's definitely leaning more into the darker retellings. She used to be a bit more whimsical. Hasn't been whimsical in the last couple of entries from her, but I kind of love it. And we already know, if you've read her horror novels, you know that she can do darker themes well. She's really good at just writing characters. I don't think that her plots matter as much. It's really about falling in love with the characters, and that was the case here, or really hating the characters. She makes you hate the characters you're supposed to hate. So we have two POVs in this book, and one is Cordelia, and her mother is just horrible. Her mother is a sorceress, and they have to flee from their town in the middle of the night. Cordelia has no idea why, but she's been very isolated by her mother. It has to follow all these rules. She can't close her door. She's not allowed to talk to other people. She's silenced for weeks on end, things like that. So this is very odd that they would just flee in the middle of the night like this. And her mom is trying to seduce this wealthy man. And we get this man's sister, Hester, her perspective. And Hester is smart and she sees what's going on here, but her brother cannot see it. And she wants to kind of save Cordelia and her brother at the same time. Things get really dark, and it really delves into abusive relationships between like a mother and a daughter. And there's some twists and turns, like there's a mystery of it in this as well. And then we see Cordelia make true relationships, which was endearing, and people fighting for her. So there's some hope in the darkness as well. And I think that that is something that Tegan Fisher excels at. I'd be curious to read like even just a synopsis of the original story of the Goose Girl. That's probably something I should do. But if Tegan Fisher continues to go into this darker retelling direction, I would love it, because I think she's great at it. But I hope she does a couple whimsical ones in between, because man, her books lately have been super, super heavy. I finally read Entreat Me by Grace Draven. I'm on a journey with fantasy romance. I don't know what I like. I've DNF'd so many that I maybe eventually will come back to or talk about in a future video, but I'm just trying to figure out what works for me and what doesn't. And so far, Grace Draven works for me. Radiance, my favorite fantasy romance of all time. It's impossible to beat, and I think I've set myself up for failure on that one because it's one of the first fantasy romance books I ever read. But this is a Beauty and the Beast standalone from her, and I really liked it. And that's saying something because I don't tend to like Beauty and the Beast retellings. I say this all the time. I love the animated movie. It was one of my favorite things as a kid. But when you delve into the themes of it and you try to make it a romance, I struggle with it. But I think in this case, Grace Draven did enough that subverted what you tend to expect from a Beauty and the Beast retelling and made it believable, made me feel less icky about it. And I really, really loved our main character. Actually, she's a very confident and she stands up for herself, and they have a great dynamic, and you can see some of the typical plot points from the original Beauty and the Beast that are actually like really sweet moments, but it's steamy and she is confident in that, and I like that. But there's also another relationship that we're focusing on, and that is her sister and the Beast, in this case his son. So you're not just focused on this one couple, which I think is refreshing, gives you a little break from the intensity of it as well. There's a family curse. I think that this actually leans more into the fantasy than a lot of the other Beauty and the Beast retellings that I have read, and the world is a lot more interesting, and we just see a lot of things happening outside of what's happening like in this castle. I do think that we could have leaned into some of the Roses stuff. Like the Roses are deadly and violent in this, and they hold a bit of a grudge, and I liked that. I wish we got more of that. But you understand the curse as well. The curse is coming from somewhere different, and yeah, there are a lot of great layers to this, but it is super smutty, and I appreciated that. I really liked the main character in this. I liked the relationship between the two of them. There's a moment where she trims his nails. That was super sweet, so I never thought I would say that ever in my life, but it was so cute like that. There were some like moments where you're just like, aw, and then there were some moments where like, ooh, that was steamy, and then some were like, you're angry, you don't know what's going on. I just think it's great. And the last book that I finished in August is The Weaver and the Witch Queen by Genevieve Gornichuk, and this was for, you guessed it, the Black Hat Book Coven book club. And when you think about witchy books, like if I'm gonna put together a list of witchy book recommendations, this probably wouldn't be one that comes to mind at first, because it's not your typical witchy book. It's not around Halloween or anything like that. It's definitely historical. It's Norse mythology, but I did really like it, and it seemed to go over pretty well within the book club, which is rare. It's rare that everybody at least likes it, so that is a win for us. And there are different types of magic in this one. So my favorite was, there's like these threads. I've read that a few times where the powers are you're threaded to like your soul, or there's threads that attach people. I always think that is interesting. I like the way it was done in this one. And the witches in this one can turn into different animals. So our main character's like a swallow or something, which I thought was a random bird to be, but you know, or like somebody's a seal. It's really interesting. I know that sounds silly, but it makes sense in the context of the book. Then there's more of the healing witches and stuff like that. So you get a lot in terms of that. But I didn't expect this to be so much of a romance. There's two romances. We're following obviously the Weaver and the Witch Queen. So we get both of their perspectives. They were friends when they were little girls. The Witch Queen in this case had an abusive relationship with her mother, and we see them as children and as that is happening. And the three of them, because the other sister is involved in this, there's two sisters and the Witch Queen. The three of them make this blood bond, saying they're always going to protect one another, and that starts the series of events. And it's all this thing about fate and how they together are going to either destroy or save the world kind of stuff is happening. And we see them get separated. Then a really tragic event happens that had me in tears, and we see the fallout from that. And they both have different romances that were hard to root for at times, but in the end kind of made sense. And I'm going to leave our discussion down below, because this is one of all the discussions that we've had in the book club. I feel like this is the one where we really got into the themes of it and certain scenes that happened and things like that. Definitely spoilery, so I'll read the book first. But I know that this author wrote A Witch's Heart, is that what it's called? And people tend to like that one. That's like a Loki retelling, so I'll go back and read that eventually, because I was really impressed with this one. And then my DNF, it was another witchy book club read, and only one of us finished it, and Laura probably shouldn't have, because she hated it. So watch that. live discussion if you want to have a good laugh. This is Daughter of Blood by Anne Bishop. Now, this was written in the 90s, and I think it was popular in the 90s, but I'm not sure that it's one that's held up. Anybody that I've talked to that loved it seemed to have read it like in the 90s and the early 2000s. It's like a product of its time kind of thing. I think Sarah J Maas was inspired to write ACOTAR, or she got some influence of that series from this book, which I can't speak on because I haven't read ACOTAR, but the other members of the book club have, so we touched on that a little bit, but we only read like 20%, so you can't really get into the weeds of all that too much if you've only read a fifth of the book. But what I did read, struggled with it. It was one of those books where you're reading words, but they have no meaning. I couldn't grasp on to any of the themes, any of the characters, the plot. There's one perspective, there's a lot of perspectives, but there's one perspective that I actually thought was interesting. He's like Satan himself, and if it was just his perspective throughout the entire book, I probably could have gotten on board with it, but I could see where some of the romance was going, and she was a young girl when they met, and it was just disgusting, and it gave me the ick. And then Laura told us more about where it goes in the end, and I'm glad I put it down. That's all I'll say about that one. It just wasn't for me in any way, shape, or form, and I think there are a million books in the series as well, so I'm just glad I abandoned it. Don't feel bad that I was the only one. I feel bad that Laura actually finished it, but I do know that there are some people that love that book, so don't just take my word on this one. I'm just curious if anybody who's read it recently loved it. I think they're actually reprinting it with new covers, which I'll be intrigued to see when that comes out what a new readership thinks about it, or if they make any changes to it at all. So we will see. I'll keep an eye on that, but not for me. Won't be finishing that series, won't be finishing that book in general. There we go. Those are all the books that I read this summer. I can't wait to get into my October reads and to be back into my reading mood, my filming mood. It'll all come back in October. That's when I really get into it, and I'll be in my normal setup with the books surrounding me. I'll be inspired to get into that. So let me know your thoughts on any of these. If you have read them, let me know what the best book you read this summer was. I'd love to talk about it. Thanks again for your support. Talk to y'all soon. Bye for now.